no further ado, I'd like to bring Alan up onto the stage.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So for those of you I haven't had the chance to meet, very briefly, I used to be a computer scientist, focused on encryption. I wasn't very good at it, so I got a PhD in applied economics. I wasn't very good at that. Postdoc in computational modeling. Turns out also mediocre at that. When you're mediocre at that many things, you sort of end up in Washington, D.C. And so after a few years in the think tank world, I joined the Department of Commerce, and we focus on figuring out how to bring together different parts of the security community to basically foster market change and more responsive markets that capture the security that we all know we need. So for today, should you be looking at your phone? Well, we'll see if you care about this. We're going to talk, brief overview for those who are not familiar with the concept of what is a software bill of materials. We're going to talk about why now might be the right time to move forward on this particular issue. And then we're going to say, hey, this is what's going on. How can you get involved? So first, a bit of background. What is a bill of materials? Right? In the manufacturing world, we have a pretty universal practice. If you buy something or you build something, you know what's in it. Helps for inventory, helps for asset management, helps you to know what risks there are. This is a very commonly understood practice. So why not software? Well, there are lots of reasons why software is different from hardware. And so one of the things we're going to try to do is to establish why we may care about knowing what are the third-party components and their dependencies. Modern software isn't hewn out of alabaster marble by gifted artisans on small Greek islands. Right? Modern software is assembled from parts that we all know, we all use, we all reuse. This is part of good code design, it's reusing code. But sometimes the basic building blocks may not be the most solid. So having visibility into what goes into the systems on which we all depend could have some very real value. And I'll give you an example. Anyone know what this car is? It's a Mercedes S-Class from 2013. And we already have some visibility of what's in this car from a software perspective because of software licenses, right? If you open your iPhone today, you can see that it has, these are the open source licenses that it has. And so Mudge observed 2 years ago that if you bought this brand new Mercedes S-Class, it came with libtiff. Anyone like have libtiff in their car? That's networked. Netcat, so you can move around your network. And basically what this means is your brand new car came pre-owned. Right? You have the ability to use an easily poppable library and then move anywhere on whatever the network can get. So there's real value in sort of having a certain amount of transparency. Now, do we expect everyone to be able to use this data? Of course not. The focus of this initiative really is a discussion between vendors of different types, enterprise software, medical devices, and enterprise-grade consumers. Right? These are the people who have some ability to understand this information and use risk. So what's the value here? Well, we think that it makes sense that a software vendor should be able to communicate this for a couple of reasons. One, this is an excellent sign that you have a good process, right? Are you shipping something that is made with the freshest of ingredients? Or are you shipping something with outdated code? It's what economists call an efficient signal. Do I have a good process? Well, it's very hard to know the details of what the underlying development process is. But we do know that it's pretty hard to produce this if you don't have a good development process. And there are a number of people who have sort of come forward and said it's actually pretty easy to produce this if you have a good internal development process. Moreover, it's a great aspect for the market. Right? I'm looking at two products, I want to buy them. Something that we all know, this is a common trope of the market failure in security. How can I compare two products? Having a list of ingredients helps us with that discussion. Now, from the enterprise customer's perspective, there's real value in one, again, knowing what you're going to be putting on your network. Is this outdated code? And maybe that's okay. Maybe you want to buy something that has some older libraries because it's the best product for you. But now you can be prepared. You can take certain mitigation and protection steps that help you understand the risk. And more importantly, as new risks emerge, we'll be able to sort of understand and react to them more quickly. Right? The analogy of a list of ingredients isn't perfect, but there's real value, right? I go to the store, I buy what I like, I put it on the shelf, and that's all well and good until my sister-in-law comes over with a deathly allergy to peanuts. Option one, I call up Nabisco and say, hey, can you tell me, does this have peanuts? I call up every company. Or alternatively, I look at the list of ingredients and take the appropriate risk steps that I can judge. Not everything can be easily patched when new flaws emerge. We don't know whether they're going to be exploitable or not, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. But again, this is something that an organization can begin to understand and better take mitigation and preparation steps. The final value that we think this has is it's really hits to something that we talked a lot about recently, which is end-of-lifing. Especially in the connected device and embedded device space, where we're using some older libraries that are built to handle older hardware. There are stories that you hear of a lot of these key libraries saying, you know what, there are now a lot of modern GPUs, we're not going to support single threading anymore. Well, whoops. All of my hardware is single threaded, so now I have to figure out what is my long-term plan to replace this. All right, so if you're with me now, maybe you've got a few questions, or maybe you're saying, well, why aren't we doing this already? So let's take a quick trip down memory lane in Washington, D.C. This is not a new idea. Right? This is not something that I came up with or that anyone in the room came up with. We've been talking about this for a while. In fact, it was proposed in regulation in 2013 and 2014. There was a requirement that said that everything that the DoD bought had to come with a software bill of materials. This was proposed by Congress. It did not pass. It was, in fact, nuked from orbit by the IT sector. And there are a couple of reasons why I think they did. First, I'm from the Department of Commerce. We're not wild about regulation. We like the free market. Regulation shouldn't be in the business of telling people to do things that we don't really know how to do. And so that's what this initiative that we're assembling is all about. So what's changed? Well, first, one of the major obstacles is I'm not sure in 2013 how many major software vendors could honestly say that they weren't shipping GPL code. So this is now something that everyone understands, right? If your general counsel isn't thinking about this, you need to find a new lawyer. If you're a startup and you're interested in acquisition, you already have thought about this problem. If you're a large company, you don't have an interest in buying Richard Stallman a third house. You want to make progress. But there are a lot more things going on in Washington as well. The regulators are starting to get involved. So the healthcare sector has basically committed to moving forward in this. There was a report, there was a congressional task force that identified this as a priority. Congress took this, told HHS, which thinks about the healthcare sector for the United States, and told the FDA, we want this as a priority. There are a bunch of priorities we have for cybersecurity. The healthcare sector needs a lot of help, but this is going to be a priority. So this is going to be moving forward on that. Second, in case you've been paying attention to the news, a lot of people in Washington are suddenly very concerned about chains that have supplies on them. There's a real challenge here of making sure that we know what we have. Now, my concern looking at this is that we're going to find different solutions in different parts of the ecosystem. We shouldn't be moving forward where there's a healthcare way to solve this, and an auto sector way to solve this. And if you sell to the government, you'd have to do it a third way. And that's where the Department of Commerce comes in. Again, we like markets. My general counsel really likes it when I say that NTIA is the president's advisor on telecommunications and internet policy. But really, what our mission is as it relates to me is preserving a free, open, and trustworthy digital ecosystem. My equity in government is innovation. And that means we need to actually promote innovation and make sure that we can continue to go in this direction. Now, as I mentioned, we're not a regulator. We have no, well, the Department of Commerce regulates fish. But independent of that, and a little bit of export control, we won't talk about that, we have no interest in telling people what to do. And we couldn't if we wanted. We don't have legal authority to do that. And they didn't give me any money to pay people to do things. So what do we have left? Well, what we have left is something that I think is particularly suited to addressing problems like this. Problems that address a very large swath of the economy, where no single sector can drive the activity, and thus there's no forward momentum. So what we do is we convene in these lovely things called multi-stakeholder processes. And I'm not going to bore you with the mechanics and the theory behind it. All I can tell you is that for many people, it looks a little like a bunch of people shouting in a room for a long time. But the beauty about putting people in a room for a while is that eventually they start to listen to each other and find common ground. And that's the process that we started on July 19th. Now these processes, and they are called the multi-stakeholder process, and yes, my eyes start to roll a little bit better. You have to hear it, I have to say it. These processes are open, they're public, anyone can join, and in fact, it's my job to make sure that we have as diverse a set of stakeholders as possible. They're transparent. We work very hard to make sure that everyone can see what's going on. That's where the legitimacy comes from. That's where the trust comes from. All of our meetings are webcast. All of the working groups are open. The drafts are shared publicly. They're consensus-based. Consensus is one of these lovely terms that we don't know what it is, but we'll know it when we see it. It basically just means that no single person can derail something that a large body of people want to do. But it also means that if there's a sector or a dedicated group of stakeholders that feels a certain way, they can't be railroaded. It's stakeholder driven, right? Where we go comes from stakeholders. The analogy I use is, I push, but I don't steer. And we try to make sure there's as many perspectives as possible. And just very quickly, a small note on this. I hate this metaphor. Everyone knows this metaphor of the blind elephant. These are the easy problems, right? These are solved with just single bits of communication. The real problems that we're tackling are when you have three people looking at an elephant, and one of them says, that's a tourist attraction. Someone says, no, that's an important agricultural implement. And the third person says, no, that's a symbol of my national pride. The problem in all of this case is none of them are wrong. And if we want to make forward progress, we need to find a way to accommodate all of these perspectives. So what is the perspective we have? We call it software component transparency. The three basic buckets of activity. We have the need to compile the data, and that is something that's going to be in the vendor space. Someone has to be able to use this data, and of course, we need to understand how it's going to be shared. We had a kickoff meeting on July 19th in Washington, D.C. About 60, 70 people were there, a lot more online. We heard from a range of perspectives. A lot of people were big boosters of this idea. They're saying, we're gung-ho, we're going to do it. There was an observation that, in fact, this was a solved problem in some smaller circles. So let's try to capture the wisdom there. But there were also some concerns raised. So one is this notion of how do we make sure this is machine readable? Right? If this is going to be truly valuable, it needs to be something that we can automate and start to use. Right? This isn't something that we want to be grepping through PDFs. One of the key benefits of this is going to be when we can fold this into our existing tools. But automation brings a slightly more complex task, because now we need some judgment. And as you all know, there's a difference between something being vulnerable and something being actually exploitable. So as we move forward, that's something that we're going to have to keep in mind. How do we make sure that the data isn't just being shared, but doesn't have enough context so that no one can use it, especially in an automation fashion? What does the process look like? We use a working group model. New issues are identified, leads to the creation of a working group. This working group says publicly, we meet, we are going to define our scope and our work. They draft something, they share it with the broader stakeholder community, they get feedback, and we iterate until there's consensus, until we have worn away all the rough edges and found what works for most of us across this complex space. At the first meeting, there were 4 working groups that were declared. First was a notion that perhaps we should take a step back and look at this problem to make sure we can fully understand it and talk about it in a shared way. A lot of people showed up having a good idea of what a software bill of materials is, right? And at the end of the day, it is a list of dependencies that you have in software. But it's going to be very useful to understand some terminology, what the act of transparency might look like, and essentially fleshing out the dimensions of the issues so that we can make implicit decisions explicit. As we engineer solutions, let's be clear about how we're doing it. Second working group follows on the idea that this is already happening. We have the ability to learn lessons from this. So they're going to be doing some studies on state of practice. They're going to be talking to some banks, some healthcare organizations, some folks in the national intelligence community who have already thought about this. Third group, and I just want to flag also, they're going to be paying special attention again to how this data is going to be used in an organization. The third group is going to be looking at standards and formats. Again, if we want this to be automated and we want this to be used widely across the industry, we need to have some shared formats. There are 2 formats that people have brought forward that they think are very useful that are existing standards today. One is software ID tags. It's an ISO standard. It grew out of the asset management. It's XML. It's extensible. It's quite powerful and useful. We think there's a real chance that the vendors are very interested in using this. And a bunch of them have started working on this and even building proof of concept. There's also something called SPDX, Software Package Distribution Exchange. That comes out of the Linux Foundation, also with asset and license management. Turns out even the Linux Foundation is a little worried about whether or not something is under the GPL if they're trying to build a nice project. And so this working group is really going to focus on docking open source technology, which again, the majority of the third-party components are going to be from that domain, and this SWID model, which is something that might ship with the product. The final working group is going to be tackling a healthcare proof of concept. As I mentioned, regulators have signaled, leaders in the healthcare field are already moving forward. This is going to be dual-hatted with some work that comes out of the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council that has a broad cybersecurity vision. One of the components of this is going to be the software bill of materials. And so this is going to be a very useful test lab as the other groups generate ideas. Can they be integrated? How do they bounce against the reality of some folks that are trying to implement this in a new sector? So we've set this up. Here's where the real work begins. As I mentioned, the easy part is having that first meeting and having someone like me come around and say, hey, we should all talk about it. The hard part is getting into this iterative loop of actually unpacking this and rolling up the sleeves, saying, okay, what does this mean for my company, for my industry, for my sector? How can we make this something that starts in a credible and manageable practice, but is also built to scale as it's used more? How can we address some of these issues that I've talked about? Like data overload, like making sure that an organization that, can show that something isn't exploitable, so we're not wasting people's time. There are a lot of issues here. This is the beginning. The multi-stakeholder process is quite agile as far as government processes go. One of the nice things about this model is it's okay to make mistakes. If one of the working groups decides, hey, this is the wrong task, it's the wrong tack, they can change tack. If folks a few months from now say, what we need is we need to drill down on this particular aspect, or my industry has particular needs, or that works well for binaries sitting on platters, but we need to think about this slightly differently for embedded systems. That's great, because now we can have those discussions in parallel and learn from each other. So, what do we need from you? First of all, we need more people to think about, understand, and poke at this idea of software component transparency. we need I can't believe I'm about to use this word on a stage, we need some thought leadership. And we need leadership for people to bring other people to the table. We have working groups. They're going to be set up. We have some coordinators. We're going to be having our first remote meetings where you typically do a call every week, every other week. This is your chance to get involved and play a real leadership role. So please don't hesitate to reach out. On the NTI website, there are lots of documents that have further background. We've got all 4 hours or 5 hours of that first meeting from July 19th. If you want to watch a nice little video, it's relaxing, kick back with a glass of wine. Information about the working groups are there. There's even, for those of you who like some beach reading, a Federal Register notice. We try to, again, make sure that it is all transparent. But now I want to make sure that we have some time for questions or folks who have something that they want to say. So please, I turn the house lights up, and if there are any questions, we can talk about it. We're going to be having a chat afterwards. If you follow the wonderful, Lauren, excuse me. The wonderful Lauren is going to lead us to where we can have a more concentrated chat. And there are going to be a couple of meetups throughout the rest of the week if you're very interested. So please come and find me and reach out to me. So question in the middle. I will repeat it.
Okay. How many part numbers are there in a healthcare box or an automobile? And what does form fit function mean in this SBOM concept?
So I honestly cannot say how many parts there are, but there are a lot of parts. Hardware and software, right? Where the value comes in having this be recursive value so that we can track down where potential left pads might be. In terms of, go ahead.
Everybody worked on like the taxonomy for this?
Yes, and in fact, that's one of the working groups that is going to sort of scope out the problem is to address exactly what is the taxonomy. How do we map this? But as I'd also mentioned, there are some standards out there. One of the solutions that I mentioned, SWID, you talked about form and function. The data will actually follow the binary. So, it's right there on your disk. And there is today in IETF an ongoing project to turn this into a lightweight protocol so it actually doesn't take up all the space in an embedded device. Yes, Steve Libner. No, sorry.
What kind of forcing function do you have for time? To keep this recurring, an endless do loop as opposed to an iterative one.
That is a fantastic question, which is how do we make sure that we are moving forward? We have a push towards consensus. And for issues where no consensus is possible, this is the wrong format. Right? This model works when we are facing coordination problems. There's enough interest in moving forward. Now, am I admitting that the way to stymie this process, if you don't like it, just obstruct? Well, one, that sort of thing looks pretty obvious in a meeting. You've all been in meetings where someone says, let's take a step back and what are we really talking about? Everyone knows that that's an obstructive technique. But I think the bigger question is, this is about the most industry-friendly way that we will have to move forward on this project. As I mentioned, regulators are gunning for this. The Department of Defense really likes this issue. If we want to do this on our terms that actually meet the needs of vendors and, more importantly, meet the needs of the users of this data in a way that's flexible, adaptable, and evolving, so we can start small, relatively defined, understand what the next gen and the gen after that are going to look like, this is the process to move forward. So I get to be in this process. NTI gets to be the good cop. Folks who want to take their chance in the inaction of the government on security, I think, are going to find that the government is not quite as lax about security as it may have been in decades past. Yes?
So my question is relative to two of the items that you mentioned when you're talking about this project. One, you talked about the prevalence of open source, but you also are bringing up examples that are in the Internet of Things. And in many of those cases, a lot of the software will not be open sourced, but will still need to be part of the bill of materials. Has that been already considered as part of your working group, that you need to make comprehension of things that are not open source software in that SBOM?
That is a fantastic question, which is how do we capture a lot of the proprietary information, especially because every so often there'll be a contract that says, by the way, you're not allowed to tell anyone that we're shipping this. That fits into another bucket where we need to say, what are some of the edge cases to deal with this? For proprietary software that we can license, that's great. Let's move forward. In other cases, I use the ingredient list example again, which is this product has, flour, butter, sugar, eggs, and natural flavorings. So if you know most of what's in a product, you're so much further ahead than you were of knowing nothing. So again, most of the list, especially if we have a metadata plane that allows us to say this is not the complete list, I think we move forward. I'd love to chat with you more.
Okay.
And I think I might be out of time.
Okay.
So those of you who are interested, Lauren is going to be taking us to a discussion room, and happy to chat more. This is how to get in touch with me. We need your help. This will only work if you guys show up.